welcome wherever you are in the world, whether you're in wild and windy Norfolk, whether you're further afield in the UK, or indeed joining us from the far corners of the globe. We are delighted to have your company with us this evening. My name is Nick and I'm working on behalf of Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and it is my pleasure this evening to interview Lev Parikian, whose new book, Into the Tangled Bank, has just made the light of day and fallen into the hands of such people as me, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Good evening, Lev.
Good evening, Nick. Thanks so much for having me along.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for this beautiful, both physically beautiful, but also thoroughly enjoyable book. But before we get on to all the housekeeping and all the rules and regulations that I have to share with people, a little bit on you, because in addition to being an illustrious birdwatcher and writer about birds, you have other skills, do you not? And just this week you've been busy.
This week I have been busy. My actual day job, although it's not really a day job so much because it's mostly goes on in the evenings, is as an orchestral conductor. So for 6 or 7 months I was unemployed, really, from end of March through to quite recently. But just in the last 10 days, we've had the go-ahead to start going back to various orchestral rehearsals, which I've done. And I've just spent a really very enjoyable couple of days in the recording studio with the BBC Concert Orchestra, doing some, laying down some tracks, I think is what we're supposed to say, isn't it? And so that was great. And let's hope we can, keep on doing it safely and as joyously as they seem to be enjoying it. So
how lovely to be doing things in the real world and reaching But certainly you reached me with this lovely book, which we'll be talking about very shortly. But before we do that, on behalf of NWT, I have to read the riot act, as it were. Good evening once again to absolutely everybody joining us. This is, of course, a free event as part of our Cley Calling series of events. Normally we host most of them at our Cley Marshes Nature Reserve in North Norfolk, but unable to do that this year. We've taken them into the murky underworld of online, and you can find all of our other events at cleycalling.com. That's cleycalling.com, and we've got lots more exciting events coming up. The next one is with our friend Bridget Strawbridge, who's been a great friend of this series of events, and I hope she's joining us this evening. She said she would be. And then the following one after that is Matt Gore, who's our neighbour to the south. He lives in Suffolk and has just written a beautiful book called Under the Stars. So we're really thrilled to be talking to them both very soon. Now, although this is a free event, we are delighted to have support from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Now, the National Lottery Heritage Fund is particularly keen to engage a range of people from different sectors of society in their events. And so if you're able to offer feedback, we would be absolutely delighted, because it shows the National Lottery Heritage Fund that we are reaching people from a diverse sectors of society. So please do send us feedback. You'll have the opportunity to do so. There'll be a link in an email that you've received, and there'll be several links. If you wish to buy Lev's lovely book, and if you don't wish to, you are a fool, because it's a perfectly lovely read, and a really warming book to read as we enter a dark and gloomy winter. So you should wish to buy his lovely book, and you can do so through a link that will be in your chat. It will also be in the email that you've received. And that will take you to the website of our friends at Wild Sounds and Books, who stock the books for all of our visitor centres. And they very generously are making a 10% donation to the running costs of Norfolk Wildlife Trust through the purchase of Lev's book, if you follow the link that you receive. You can also, though this is a free event, should you wish, should you be so moved by Lev's book and his exposition thereof, you can make a donation through a link that Nick is another Nick. Nick is kindly producing this evening. He will be putting that link also in the chat, and it will be in the email that you have received. Now, on the subject of Nick has bravely stepped in. The person who normally produces these events has not been able to join us this evening, and so Nick has been genning up on how to run webinars on Zoom. Should we have any technical issues, it won't be his fault at all. Please try to come back into the conversation via the link that you've already got. Or alternatively, if for some reason you are blocked out at any point, you can catch up on YouTube, because the whole thing will be recorded and ultimately will end up on the Norfolk Wildlife Trust YouTube. You will doubtless have questions for Lev Parikian. Should you wish to ask him questions, you have a Q&A. Please put your questions there, write them in. Some of them I will read to him. Others of them we might try to bring you in live. Now, I'm really stretching Nick's technical abilities here. If that doesn't work, I will read them. But please do, if you have any questions, early on in the evening, if you can, get your questions in, and then I can flag them either to be read by me or indeed for us to try to bring you in. Anyway, I have waffled for quite enough, and this evening is all about Lev's lovely book, Into the Tangled Bank. So once again, Lev, welcome and thank you for joining us. In a sense, your book is now, I say this advisedly, there's a great history of nature healing books, going right back to, let's say, Peter Matheson, The Snow Leopard, the death of his wife and the journey to see snow leopards or look for snow leopards healing him. And recently books like Helen Macdonald, H is for Hawk, and our wonderful friend Dara McNulty and his Diary of a Young Naturalist. There's a great genre of books that are about healing through nature. But yours is very different from that, in a sense that you have a shot in the arm through the rediscovery of your love of nature. And that's really where you come from in this delightful book. And that's part of the delight of it.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, that if I may just bring it back a little bit, it manifested itself in the book I wrote before this, which was called Why Do Birds Suddenly Disappear, which was the very specific story of one year in my life, 2016, during which I followed the return of my love of birds in particular, which I'd had as a child. I grew up in a small village in Oxfordshire in the 70s and was quite obsessed with birds until the age of about 12 or 13, I should think. And then other things happened, life got in the way. I then moved to London in my early 20s, and really the interest in birds somehow got lost in transit, as it were, for about 25, 30 years, from teenagerhood to my late 40s. And so the Why Do Birds Suddenly Disappear was the story of 2016, in which I harnessed that return of the interest in birds and turned it into an obsession, and went out to try and see 200 species of British bird in a single year. And while I was doing that, and in the writing of the book and in the traveling around the country, I found myself not only looking for birds and looking at birds, but looking at the people who were looking at the birds. Who are, of course, a noble tribe of individuals, of human beings. And it wasn't just birders, it was all the people I met on the way. So it would be general members of the public who would be looking at me, looking through my binoculars at something in a local park and wondering what the hell I was doing. But also the people I met on nature reserves and elsewhere. And so the starting point for Into the Tangled Bank was really the end point of Why Do Birds? So the idea being that I wanted to expand the journey to all of nature and not just birds, but also to really include the people I saw in that story. So it wasn't just people and nature, it was the whole thing, because we are, we're part of it. And I think the interest in general nature, and I know birders will be familiar with this, it started, I suppose, with that lull you get in July and August when birding goes a little bit quiet and you're twiddling your thumbs and wondering what you're going to do, and suddenly you notice a butterfly and you think, oh, what's that? And so you start getting interested in butterflies for 2 months of the year. And the other thing that I found quite embarrassing in my return to birding would be when I was out somewhere, maybe in a hide or anywhere, and there'd be a couple of birders there, and they'd say, "Do you see the such and such?" And I go, "No, where is it?" And they'd say, "Oh, it's over in such and such a tree." And I wouldn't know which tree they were talking about. There was about 20 trees, and they were all different species, and I didn't know which one. So, you know, partly you're noticing that there's other branches of nature, and it's all connected. And if you're going to get along and learn more, you need to not just be focusing on the things with feathers. So that was the starting point for the book, really.
Which leads you on many lovely adventures through engaging with the people who study nature and with nature itself. And you talk about your love of butterflies. I'm about to read yourself to you, but there's one lovely thing that you say about your blossoming love of butterflies, but whole swathes of them remain mysterious, especially those orange and black masters of disguise, the fritillary family. Damn their fluttery wings, which is a charming way of confessing your blossoming love of butterflies. But just to get back to what you were talking about, you write, "Something in me shifted in that time, something fundamental. Decades had passed between my bird-watching obsessed childhood and the resurgence of interest in my late 40s, fallow decades during which the natural world more or less passed me by. And then a little later, going out to be in nature is now an unbreakable habit, a way to nourish body, mind, and soul all at once. And nearly everywhere I go, there are other people, each experiencing nature in their own way." And that's really, in a nutshell, what your lovely book is about, but it's about many, many things. I feel we should touch on the title before I go on to other questions, because it's a very specific and very weighty title, isn't it? It has great meaning.
It does. I actually quite sometimes titles, I think, come to people as the first thing. For this book, it actually was one of the last things, and I was trying to find a way into it, something that would be, you know, snappy and but also maybe evoke something about what the book was about. And I was doing lots of reading for it, and of course, you know, in the book I do visit the home of Charles Darwin, and Into the Tangled Bank the Tangled Bank is something he writes about at the end of Origin of Species. And it felt like it was summed up everybody's view of the glorious tangle of nature, and it felt like when going out into it, I was kind of going into something that had no particular shape or form and was in some ways, you know, quite confusing. So it felt like a decent title to append to the book. And of course, it would give the impression that I've read Origin of Species multiple times.
Which of course we all
have, and of course the people who recognise the reference were very quick to point out that they recognised the reference.
Of course, because everyone gets brownie points therefrom. But you yourself have a great love of words, and I think you have a great love of words as wit. And you write very wittily, but in particular your footnotes. If you're about to make a gag, some of them excruciatingly, I have to say.
They're awful. I'm sorry, I do apologise for the jokes. They're awful.
No, they're not. Some of them are charming.
I can't believe that my publishers let half of them through, but you know, you get away with it.
They're lovely, especially the footnotes, because you go off on some little aside. But this one isn't a footnote. This is in the main text. You're talking about a spider. Calm as I was about Sid's presence in the sink, my sang would have been somewhat less froid had you brought a couple of dozen friends along. There's a playfulness with words in your writing, which is delightful.
Thank you. I blame P.G. Wodehouse for that kind of thing. It's his 139th birthday today, and that felt like a sentence that he would have written and then discarded as not being good enough, but it was good enough for me. So
he is a great family hero of ours, and so that's a very fine vein to be in. But I also think, have you read much of Simon Barnes?
I have read quite a lot of Simon Barnes, yes.
And in support of Norfolk Wildlife Trust.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
You share the ability to go from exquisite observation about deeply significant things to spinning and making a light-hearted quip about it all, which is really quite delightful. Many times I thought, oh, Simon could have written that.
No, well, that's very kind of you, because Simon is one of my, obviously one of my writing heroes. And what I love about his writing is, as you say, it's serious when it needs to be, but it's not earnest in a kind of, self-aggrandizing way. He sees the world as it is, and that is, it has humor and seriousness all in a bundle. And I think I find for me that's quite important to get that across. I'm also desperately scared of boring the reader, so
I assure you don't. And if anybody hasn't read Lev before and enjoys the work of our great friend of Norfolk Wildlife Trust, Simon Barnes, then there is no higher recommendation than it reads as though Simon Barnes had a hand in it. And just to give you an example of that, it's a stunning morning, the kind of dawn that gives autumn a good name. Honestly, there are times when nature seems to be taking the piss. Here you go, have something of unfathomable beauty. Here's another and another. Careful not to faint. And that's the sort of thing that Simon would be very proud to have written. But jumping genders, and I think this is really significant. In many ways, this is a book about women.
Interesting. You mean the fact that I met a lot of women on the way, or the women naturalists that I
particularly the characters that emerge are the women naturalists who, there are women players in the story, some of them whom you gently poke fun at, but all in a loving way. But it's actually the female naturalists and scientists who I think are even stronger than characters like Charles Darwin and Gilbert White, whom we all admire and whom we've all read and about whom we all know. But the women are the strongest players to my mind. And
that's good of you to say that. When having decided that I'd write this book about uttered nature, there were several things I wanted to kind of backtrack a bit. There were several things I wanted to include. It wasn't, the first problem I had was, okay, so it's a very broad subject. How do I go about it? Am I just going to go out randomly to all these places that I like, or, that I want to go to, and just see who I meet? Am I going to go and interview people? What am I going to do? And I quite soon found a way of making the journey have some sort of direction, which was to go to places associated with great naturalists. So I drew up a long list. I've got the spreadsheet still, thinking of all the people I got on Wikipedia and, from my own brain, and wrote all these down. And quite soon it became quite clear that about 80% of them were men. In fact, at least 80% of them, because they were, so much of it was looking at the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, when women they did, but they weren't allowed to do it. They weren't allowed to join the big clubs. They weren't allowed, they weren't thought of as being naturalists. There were some notable exceptions, but in general, it was a thing for blokes with beards and big frock coats, the image. And I thought it was quite important to try to represent something else. So I, did a bit more digging and found some really important women. I mean, Etta Lemon is the example that springs to mind, who was, early founder of the what turned into the RSPB. Or Anna Atkins, who came up with those fantastic some of the first experiments in photography with her cyanotypes of algae and so on.
If I can just butt in at that point, but another reason for reading Lev's lovely book is to open your mind to the work of Anna Atkins, because these things are just breathtakingly beautiful.
They are absolutely exquisite, and I, to my shame, didn't really know much about her. My attention had been brought to her by my friend Emma Mitchell, who you might know from the book The Wild Remedy, and is very active on Twitter, and we have a strong banterful Twitter friendship, and I've met her a few times, and she's always said, Anna Atkins is just an absolute hero of hers. So I delved a little bit more into her life, and tried to think about that connection, or the progress of photography, and how representing nature in images is a strong part of a lot of people's engagement with it, whether it's drawing, or Thomas Buick, who also features with the wood engravings, or even more so nowadays the photographers. So it was really interesting to delve into that and to examine the different ways the people I featured express their love of nature. So you have, again, mentioning some of the other names, Darwin, of course, was a great scientist. Gilbert White devoted his life to one patch and observed over many years the changes and the developments there. John Clare expressed his love of the natural world in poetry. So there are all these different ways of expressing it that I found interesting and thought would be useful to also interesting because they lived in different parts of the country. So you can then join the dots that way as well.
It works beautifully, and I do have to highlight. There are several women you touch on and explore their lives and their work. And Anna Atkins is one of the ones I feel is particularly important, and also Carolina Herschel, whose work was quite as extraordinary as her brother's. But from a Norfolk Wildlife Trust point of view, Emma Turner is our great friend. And I feel, have you been to Hickling Broad?
No, and I still haven't. I
feel we need to arrange this. I'm slightly speaking out of turn, but I am formally inviting you to visit us at Hickling Broad, and I would be delighted to show you round, so that you can see where Emma lived and worked, because, well, tell us about her. She was a most extraordinary woman.
Well, I first came, my introduction to her was that extraordinary photograph of the bittern that she took. I can't remember what the year is now. But it's a juvenile, isn't it? And it's pointing straight up, and it's how you think of bitterns, with the reeds vertically behind her. But at the time she was doing it, in the early 20th century, this was a huge palaver. We now think of photography as the easiest thing in the world. You just grab your phone, point it, and take as many as you like. But of course, even though it had come on from when Anna Atkins was doing her cyanotypes in the 50, 60 years between those two things, it had come on a lot. It was still, you were carrying a lot of equipment and waiting very patiently or seeking something out. And you had no idea whether what you photographed was actually going to come out at all. And her thing, I think, was the technique of waiting, kind of waiting to see what came rather than setting things up. If I put that correctly, if you see what I mean. And so the images that she took were quite striking. She was quite fearless as well with her. The discomfort she was happy to endure. She thought nothing of covering herself in foliage in a bog for 12 hours, waiting for a snipe to turn up. Maybe some people find that a fun way of spending their days, but I don't quite so much. So I'm full of admiration for her, her fearlessness, and also for any woman who's doing these things in a man's world. Always has my admiration.
And she did so much more than just take photographs. She was a warden of Scolthead Island here in Norfolk, which was a fiercely male-dominated job. And she lived on a houseboat on Hickling Broad. I mean, she really was. She's a real heroine of ours at Norfolk Wildlife Trust.
Indomitable.
Indomitable, quite the word. And our friends, our sister organisation in some ways, the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society, they've just brought out a book of her life.
Yes, I saw. I eagerly await reading. it. And
no, it's well worth it. And you say of her in your gentle way, if Emma Turner were around today, I would show her my phone with some sheepishness, because, of course, of the difficulty she had in taking such photos. Yeah. Now, it's also very much a book of experiencing, and you have touched on that already, experiencing Darwin's scientific mind, Gilbert White's constant observation of a single patch, John Clare's experiencing the world through words and through poetry, Anne Atkins, and experiencing the world in imagery, going on then to Emma Turner. But something that really touches a chord with me, and perhaps I'll share some anecdotes of my own in a moment, is that you actually talk about getting rid of the baggage that gets in our way of a raw experience of nature. So if I can read to you of yourself, I had my camera. It would have been the work of a few seconds to bring it to my eyes and fire off a burst, but none of them would come close to the memory of it later on. Besides, I have the memory of my own cuckoo moment to keep me going through the long winter months. And later, much later in the book, sometimes it's enough just to sit in silence in a quiet place with people of like mind, looking out over water, absorbing the contours and shapes and colours and swells and crooks and hollows, saying nothing, but just allowing the world to drape itself over you, bringing you together in a conspiracy of beauty. And then with your usual bathos, cheese sandwich, optional. So to me, it's also about, your book is also about experiencing nature in your own deeply personal way that doesn't need to be interfered with by other people's interpretations.
Yeah, yes, that's very perceptive. So several things that arose from that. Firstly, what you say about it not being interfered with and experiencing it in your own way. One of the things that occurred to me quite early on was when I was walking around really in my local area in South London, where there's a local cemetery, which is pretty good for the local birds, and there's a common, and there's some woodland there. It's very urban, but there are green spaces. But it's mostly people just out going for a walk, not necessarily engaging with nature or going bird watching or looking for butterflies or whatever it is. And most often it's a silent, private experience. So you can walk past somebody and you can't tell really whether they are enthusiastic about it or whether they're just ignoring it completely, or whether it's something that they are, what they're noticing. So, and that's something that I've experienced. You can't, I wrote in Why Do Birds Suddenly Disappear about how I really wanted, when I met birders, especially male birders, I have to say, I wanted them to show some form of enthusiasm. Because I'm sure you're familiar with that experience of being, especially in a hide, with half a dozen people, and it's like a library in there. People are just sitting there, and you can't quite tell, are they enjoying it or not? It seems all very glum. And actually, what you want is for them to say, "Shit, did you see that?" Just occasionally you would get something like that, but you want just a little bit more openness, maybe. So that was speaking to that very personal experience. You can't quite tell when you meet somebody what they're feeling, but you hope that they're experiencing the same as you, and they might be looking at something completely different or feeling something completely different. With the cuckoo, that particularly occurred to me on I wrote about that encounter. I think it was a cuckoo being mobbed by a whitethroat. I think it was a whitethroat. I decided it was. And it was just one of those occasions when I heard a commotion and became aware of it, and it was in mid-spring, so the foliage was pretty thick, but there were the occasional gaps between the branches and the leaves, so I could just find you had to kind of dodge around to get the look of the cuckoo, and then it moved again. and as I say in the book, I could have tried to take a photograph of it, but actually my time and energy was better spent just drinking it in and remembering to experience it, in the moment. You'd call it mindfulness, I think, wouldn't you? Maybe, just being, this is the moment, isn't it wonderful? Rather than fiddling around with, I've got to get this thing out and I missed it and it's gone by then. So that's what that was about, really. And not forgetting to, not forgetting to actually experience whatever it is.
Yeah, and you take it a stage further, and this is, in a sense, brave, or one might say heretical, and it's something I've often reflected on myself, that nobody ever dares say anything, and you don't attack the BBC Natural History Unit in any way, but you make the point that, in fact, it can be that the output of the BBC Natural History Unit can be a substitute for the real experience that is nowhere near as rich. So if I can just read to you, well, nature in our daily experience of it will never be this cinematic. And while it's important and amazing to be shown the glories and grandeur of natural phenomena of all kinds from all over the world, there's a danger that the definition of nature lover becomes one who loves nature programs. No matter how immersive and gripping these programs are, they're no substitute for getting out into the pissing rain in the vain expectation that the drab mud flat before you will yield something more dramatic than a distant and bedraggled shelduck.
I think we've all had that experience, haven't we?
Oh, certainly I have.
The distant and bedraggled shelduck. Yes, I must say, I wrote that quite carefully because, and it does express exactly what I feel. And you're right, I didn't want it to come out as an attack of the Natural History Unit because it really isn't. And I love their output and I'll watch it again and again and again. And those programs are awe-inspiring. But exactly as I put it, you want to inspire people. But at the same time, if we look at that and think that's what it's going to be like every time, we're going to be sorely disappointed. And especially I think that's with relation to education of young people. It's vital that they have that first-hand experience rather than expecting it all to be the killer whales and the thrashing and the blood and the colour. But at the same time, those programs are very important for learning about the natural world on our shores and from the places we'll never go. And of course, especially recently, educating us about the state of the world, the state of the natural world, and to inspire people. So.
But I think you are right that really a love of nature is about, and it goes back to what we were talking about just before, it is about that personal experience. And no matter how glorious the experience on screen, it's not the same as smelling the rain on the ground and seeing the slug and just pinching a leaf and smelling what the chlorophyll smells like. Those are the intimate and personal moments, and those are really what imbue in you a love of nature. And if I can just recall one of my own anecdotes, I've now given up because I didn't believe that the carbon climate impact was outweighed by the benefits. But I have led nature tours all over the world, and I was once in Madagascar, and we were under a tree full of sobbing Indris. Now, this is an experience I've had many times. So I don't know if you're familiar with Indris, but the biggest of the lemurs, the ones who howl to establish their territories. And every time I hear it, and I have heard it many, many times, I cry because it is so extraordinary. And these animals were in a tree right above us, and there was a bit of drizzle. And I said to a lady standing next to me in my group, what an utterly extraordinary experience. And she said, I didn't get the shots I wanted. And I thought to myself, I've got nothing. I don't know what to do. And it's that very thing of not being able to experience that extraordinary thing.
Yeah, I had a very similar, rather more pathetic, because it was a RSPB reserve in England, but a similar experience in my first couple of months of 2016, when I was going out to the beginning of writing Why Do Birds Suddenly Disappear. And I was watching lapwings displaying, that tumbling flight. And there were probably about, 15 of them, all doing their thing right in front of me. And of course, especially as somebody who had grown up in the 70s in the countryside, this was an incredibly evocative sight for me, because I remember them being a really common bird in Oxfordshire, and always behind the tractor on the fields. And in the interim, they've got rather scarcer. But also, in any case, it's a spectacular thing to watch. And a bloke came up, trudged along the path next to me, stood next to me for a bit, and then just asked if, I didn't know what to say. And he didn't seem to be in any way moved by the lapwings, but asked if I'd seen the water pipit. And I go, no, I didn't really know at that stage. Was there anything special about a water pipit? But look at the lapwings,
Which are such glorious and, as you say, evocative birds.
And I like water pipit, isn't it? But as much as the next person, but they're,
Yes, they're not. It's not when they're displaying. In fact, when a water pipit is up an alpine slope and they're lovely peachy breast plumage of the spring, and they're doing their parachuting display, and they are quite exquisite birds. But in winter or on a cold, when you're seeing the display of lapwings, now. Another, in a way that's very honest, in a way that's very powerful, you go to the zoo, at which you have a number of experiences, and you make this comment: better for a child to see a gorilla and feel its sadness than not to see a gorilla at all. Now, there's also an experience with a penguin that's particularly powerful. Tell us about your experience at London Zoo.
Yeah, I have, and I think I discussed this. I have very mixed feelings about zoos, and I chase myself around with the different complexities and nuances of the argument. I know people who are absolutely adamantly anti-zoos under any circumstances, and I know people who are passionately pro them, especially as means of raising awareness and conservation work. The experience at London Zoo was quite expensive for a start, as it probably should be. It was interesting to see there was a school trip basically going around alongside me, and the gorillas were doing their thing, which is sitting, looking a little bit morose, and the children some of them were completely unengaged. I have to be honest, they were just on a school trip. And for them, it was walking around this thing, it was a bit cold, and then they go to the shop and then they go home. But a few of them were looking at the gorilla and being interested and kind of watching it and making jokes about it and making noises towards it, and but they were seeing it, and they were being, they were in an environment where they could see a huge range of animals. The thing that I really remember from the trip is the little girl whose mother was completely uninterested, but the girl wanted to look at the penguins and was absolutely fascinated by them, pressing her nose up against the glass, and they were doing their thing, swimming and being very acrobatic and very sweet and endearing. And she just wouldn't take no for an answer from her mother. He said, "No, Mum, penguins." And she said, "Of course, I agree." So I came away again in a mixed mood about it, because so there are some of the, there are birds in cages there, and I don't like birds in cages much. And there were also animals that looked completely happy and had plenty of room to move in their chosen habitat, and they were given free meals every day and taken very good care of. And of course, the ZSL does great work around the world in conservation. I feel quite unqualified to go any deeper into it than that, to be honest, because I don't work in that field, and I'm sure there'll be people who will be able to say much more eloquently than I can. But that experience, I wanted to explore it because it is, for many people, it's the only real experience of live wildlife that they think of, you know.
And what comes across, again, as with all the chapters in your book, is that idea that those axes where our lives collide with the natural world, which really is what the whole book is around. Those moments that with that little girl who is transported into another place by that encounter with the penguin, and that's what's so beautiful about it, because her joy is so pure, and so in the same way as yours is when you're watching your cuckoo. There's that connection that makes us more ourselves in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other emotion I had on that occasion was simply I just wanted to grab the mother and say, "Come on." You know, I know we judge other people's parenting at our peril, but you know, there was that you've paid 35 quid for this. The least you can do is look. But I very wisely I held my counsel and I walked away. And then wrote about it in the book.
Perhaps you had learned your lesson from your tremendous enthusiasm behind Gilbert White's house early on or was it Darwin's house? Apologies,
No, it was Gilbert White's house with the grumpy dog owner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, he was miserable.
But again,
he's not watching.
I should think probably not. Now, before I go on to my last line of inquiry, for the last 20 minutes or so of our interview, please do submit questions. We've got a couple already. I'll read one of them out in just a moment, and I've invited someone to join us shortly as well. But
we've got a couple in the chat and a couple in the Q&A, haven't we?
Yeah. Do we have questions in chat as well? We should.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Some people have gone into. Oh, I do apologise. That isn't the way things normally happen. So we'll then have plenty. I apologise. I couldn't see the chat right there. But I wanted to ask you, Lev, because there is something. Your book is a journey. It's a charming journey, and it travels through time in one sense. Because we go from quite old ways of looking at nature to very hyper-modern ways of looking at nature. We go through different mindsets. We obviously cover a certain amount of distance geographically. They're all within the context of the British countryside, which is lovely. But it's also very much a book about scale within observation of nature. And that's that there is if I can use a word that will have a meaning in the context of the book, but a telescoping outwards of focus from the very tiny. So you start lying on your tummy on a pavement, being somewhat eccentric, looking at a common blue, which is
perfectly normal behaviour.
Normal. Well, in your own words, let the record show my strangeness for all to see. And that is quite the sort of thing I'd be seen doing. Don't you worry about that. Yeah. But then you move from observation of the very tiny and the internal. So if I can just read you a couple of bits from there. How many times have I walked past the copse or through a wood, or even looked out of the window into the garden without giving a second's thought to the constant frenetic activity taking place under the trees' calm exterior? So we've got the cellular level, and of course Darwin's obsession with the earthworm. We've got the minute and the extremely local, but then of course the book ends launched to the stars, and you very cleverly spin it back to a common blue butterfly, which is where you began. A movement catches my eye, a fluttering, scattery, apparently random movement, as of one not quite in control but going there anyway. A common blue butterfly. Through a gap in the trees, I glimpse the telescope. quietly exploring the furthest reaches of the known universe. A stray bee buzzes around my head, then lopes off back to the hive, there to perform unfathomable miracles. And I think of it all, from bees to Beetlejuice, all made of the same stuff, repurposed stardust. So you take us on a journey, really, from the minute and microscopic to the vast wonders of the heavens.
Yeah, that was always the idea. And I think the final chapter, in which I visit two observatories, the one at Kielder Observatory, the two telescopes, the Kielder Observatory in Northumberland, to look through, a lensed telescope at the. We did manage to see some things, even though it was a bit of a blustery and a rainy, cloudy night. But also to Jodrell Bank, where they have a radio, the great iconic radio telescope. And it occurred to me, because I listen to various things and I hear, very amateur interest in science of all kinds. And I hear astrophysicists talking about nature. And when they talk about nature, they mean quantum mechanics, or they mean going out to Venus, which, if you talk to most passers-by, if you said the word nature, they would probably talk about birds and bees and trees. And it just got me thinking about what we mean by nature. And of course, when you think about it for even 2 seconds, it's everything. Nature means the whole cosmos, not just that tree. So it felt like it was a natural progression from looking at the night sky on Skocum, where the sky is a lot clearer than it is here in light polluted South London, to then jump to actually taking the focus to beyond Earth and thinking, contemplating those huge things, having started with contemplating those tiny things that I've read with fascination about the network of trees and all the stuff going on that we don't see or don't even contemplate. So it felt like a natural progression to me.
And it works absolutely beautifully. And to go back to a time of Darwin and of Gilbert White, both of them profoundly religious men, but to quote Haydn in your other profession, if we think of the creation, God and nature being essentially the same thing in those days, but the heavens are telling the glory of God, the wonder of his works displays the firmament. Now, on that note, I would like to bring in, Nick, I hope you'll be able to do this. Could we bring in Eleanor? No, sorry, I apologize. Could we bring in Nina Rai, who has a question that bridges Lev's two careers? Are we able to bring in Nina? Nina, hello. Your microphone should go live any second. Nina, do we have?
Hello. Yes, I wasn't expecting to speak, sorry. I had a question for Lev, whether he thought that musicians had a particular connection to the natural world through sound. And I guess that I was thinking of that because there are a lot of birders in the choir I belong to. And admittedly, we are very grey. We are a very white and grey choir with some younger people. Yeah, I was just really interested in that, because I suppose I got interested in birding through learning the songs, and Nick was one of the people who helped me do that through some NWT courses I went on.
Right,
so.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I thought when I came back to birds after that long gap, and as I explored it, and actually through Simon Barnes's books, the how to be a bad bird watcher, and particularly how to bird watching with your eyes closed, isn't it? That's his second one, about birdsong, and of course realizing the advantages of identifying birds through the sounds they make, because 90% of the time the first experience you have of a bird is the sound, rather than the sight. So I thought I'd bone up on my bird song, and I thought, I'm a musician. It'll be easy. I'll be able to pick this up very quickly. And I got a box set of CDs, the British Library CDs with all the bird songs on, and it starts with Great Northern Diver, and then goes through, plays a couple of recordings of corn bunting. I also listened to those on my commute, and found myself in a fog of absolute confusion and terror because it was impossible. And I realised it was because I was expecting, and the most notable mistake I made was thinking that the robin on the recording was what all robins sounded like, note for note. So I kind of memorised it and mentally transcribed it in my head in musical notation, which is, kind of thinking the ups and downs and the sides and the gaps, and then couldn't get my head around that the fact that all robins sound the same but different. So they're not singing exactly the same note. I mean, shift chaff, yeah, they sing the same note. Shift chaff, just two notes. And I had to think of it in a completely different way. So now I think of a robin as having a certain voice, like Nick has a certain voice. So whatever you're saying, I would now pretty much recognise your voice. In the same way that whatever a robin is singing, you generally are able, once you're tuned into it, to remember to recognise what species it is. So to that extent, it's an advantage and a disadvantage, I think, because I, as a classically trained musician, I was thinking literally of musical phrases. Since I've managed to get my head around that, I found it a lot easier, but I'm still terrible at calls. I'm still, the different zip or trip or zip, or the differences between all those things that you'll hear most often, especially at this time of year in the foliage, is kind of very confusing. But there's always that moment. I had that moment this morning. I heard and saw my first redwings of the year. And I was just walking around the cemetery and I heard that, and instantly, once you've got it, you go, right, there it is. And I suppose being a musician, being able to listen in that particular way, especially as a conductor, maybe, that's how I've been trained. It can be helpful, yeah, it can.
In that context, may I just thank Jill Claridge, who has asked a very similar question, in fact, so I won't bring her in, but thank you, Jill, for your question, because it's also about that connection between a musician's ear and a naturalist's ear. Now, we have a question from Eleanor McAllister Dilks.
Hi, Eleanor.
How have you been enjoying nature this year, given lockdown and COVID situation? Has your experience of engaging with nature changed? Any particularly memorable moments you'd care to share?
Well then, it's interesting for several reasons. It's a very good point. It gives me a chance to give a pre-plug to the book that I'm in the middle of writing at the moment, which will be out, I hope, if I finish it, this time next year. It's provisionally entitled 72 Seasons, and it's a year on my local urban patch in South London, but based on the traditional Japanese calendar of micro-seasons. So rather than the broad sweep of 4 seasons, those ancient Japanese and Chinese calendars on which it's based, subdivide the 4 seasons at first into 6 each. So you've got 24 seki, which are the slightly kind of medium divisions. And then each of those is divided into 3 for 72 micro seasons, or ko, which are, each of them is 5, sometimes 6 days long. And each of them has its own little name. So it might be cranes fly north, or bush warblers start singing, or iris is coming into bloom. It's a very kind of haiku-like thing. So that, as a result of writing that book, I'm obviously paying even closer attention to those seasonal changes. And with lockdown coming right early on in that year, it struck me, extremely forcibly the way that we notice things. We were forced, all of us, to be in our own small area. Whether it was, we had the luxury of a garden, we were given one walk a day at that time, and we could use it how we liked. A lot of people went to the shops. I used it to extend it as long as possible, avoiding people as much as possible, but trying to find the green spaces and going there, getting as much out of it as I could. But I was particularly struck by people's reactions to it. People who I knew didn't really have an interest in nature, who I knew in other fields, and who would be emailing me and saying, "Have you noticed the birdsong's louder this year?" And I said, "Well, I've noticed there is birdsong. I don't think it's particularly loud, but are you sure it's not that you're just actually noticing it? Because the traffic's quieter and you're at home all the time." And it was really interesting having those conversations with people and them being engaged with it in a way that I found very encouraging and hopeful making. Because I think this is a common experience. A lot of people found themselves noticing it and valuing it much more. Because when the world closes in on you, you begin to notice your local environment much more, I think. And I think also for those people who weren't fortunate enough to have outside space in their home, that was felt even more keenly. And I knew people who would take great solace from looking at, if I post a photograph on Twitter of a bird, they'd say, "Thank you so much. I haven't been able to get out to see them, so it's really great to see these photographs." So, what was the question?
The question was about lockdown and noticing.
That's
but
right.
While we're talking about noticing, Lisa Quattromini has a question.
Lisa.
And I flagged her to bring her in live. Are you able, Nick, please, to bring Lisa into here? She is, and we hope very soon. There we go. Your microphone should be live. Good evening, Lisa.
Hi, both of you. 20 odd years ago, I used to work in Ludham on the Norfolk Broads in a very particularly wonderful boatyard called Hunter's Yard, which had 1930s wooden yachts with no engines, and it was perfect peace. And I looked out my window of my office one day and I saw a heron eating an eel, and as it ate the eel in one end, the eel came out of the other end. And I've never seen anything so bemusing and incredible in all my life. And Lev, I would love to know, what is the most bemusing and incredible thing you've seen in birding?
Oh, bemusing. Well, there are so many. I mean, I think seeing that kind of violence I think it's an important part of it, actually. Because, and I know there are people, again, I see on people being upset by that kind of raw experience, whether it's a bird of prey hitting a pigeon, say a peregrine hitting a pigeon, or even more dramatically, or kind of almost mundanely, just sitting there with the corpse of whatever it's killed, tugging at it and plucking it and pulling it, and bits everywhere and blood and guts. I had a similar experience seeing a cormorant do something quite similar, but only the first bit. We've all, I think, when you watch nature for any period of time, you will see that kind of thing, especially those birds taking a fish. A herring gull taking a fish that was almost bigger than it from a shore, and a heron doing the same thing on the Thames shoreside. So I think those things take you aback, don't they? They make you go, "Oh, crikey." I'm struggling to think of anything quite so bemusing as yours, though, at this particular moment. I'm sure the moment we've switched off, I'll go, oh yeah, there was that time.
But the book is, just to sell his book again, it is full of charming, intimate observation, moments shared with nature. So from that point of view, Lisa, also well worth reading. Now, Lev, tell us about the cover.
The cover, yes. So this is the work, I'll hold mine out as well. This is the work of a fantastic collage artist called Clover Robin, who, if you're on Instagram, I thoroughly recommend you follow her. She's obviously a great visually inclined person. And there's always that moment in my brief experience of being published, is when the email comes through with the first PDF of the proof of the cover. And you almost don't dare click on it to open it, because what if I hate it? But I instantly fell in love with this cover. It's almost exactly as it was when it first arrived in my inbox. They are very kindly. They asked me if I had any comments, and I said, would it be possible to make it reflect the modern nature experience just a little bit more? And I gave a list of things that would be quite nice to include, one of which is that crisp packet, because I think it's quite important to draw attention, even in a subtle way, to the abomination that is littering, and how ridiculously and appallingly prevalent it is. So that was my tiny contribution to a work of, almost genius, really. And all writers know the importance of a good cover. And the number of people who have, even before publication, said, this cover is fantastic, it would make me want to pick it up. And that is exactly what we want. So thank you, Clover. I've said thank you before, but thank you again.
It really is a gorgeous cover. Now, the last two questions are from the same person, and I hadn't realised. Good evening, Elizabeth. I'll read out your questions. The first one is specifically about rain, because, of course, there's plenty of rain in your book. Does Lev have a thought about people's non-appreciation for rain? We are waterproof, she says.
Hello, Elizabeth. I should say that I haven't seen Elizabeth for some years. We knew each other many, many years ago, and we've recently been back in touch, so it's lovely to see you here. Your non-appreciation for rain. I had exactly that experience today again. It's one of those British days that I know you know, where it started out nice and sunny, clouds coming across. I went out for a nice walk, completely unwaterproofed, and having looked at the forecast, and thought, okay, it's not going to rain, I'll just go out in what I'm wearing. And halfway round, clouds appear from nowhere, the wind gets up, gets colder, and starts chucking it on me. And I do write about it in the book, a particular similar experience on Skye, which was, it was drenching. On that occasion I could see it coming from a mile away, and I thought, I'm not going to have time to get home before this hits me. And so I just decided to embrace it and actually enjoy the sensation of letting my clothes get completely sodden, and it was a sort of weird switch. It doesn't always work. Sometimes I can still be miserable in rain, but it was a mental switch at that point. I thought, I'm not that far from home, and I've got the rest of the morning I can dry off in my own leisure, and actually this is quite a pleasing sensation if you allow it to be. There's the old adage, isn't there? There's no such thing as bad weather, just the wrong clothes. On some occasions I do sympathise. I can feel that. On others, if cold and wind are involved, then I'm less sanguine about it, I have to say.
Now, before we come to Elizabeth's second question, while we're on Skye, now I think you introduced this bird with, I forget if it's grok or gronk or gork or something like that, but you had a near spiritual experience with a bird, did you not?
Well, is it the red-throated divers?
Red-throated divers, indeed.
Yeah, well, the only experience I'd had of red-throated divers, which are fantastically evocative birds. All divers, I think, are extraordinary. When you see them on the water, they are, you know, they dive so smoothly. But footage I've seen of them on land, I mean, they're not designed for land, are they? They put the feet are right at the back, and they have this kind of very awkward flopping movement. But in the air, they're pretty good as well. And the only time I'd seen one was very distant through a telescope, probably about 5 miles away across the water on a freezing cold Isle of Sheppey with my friend David, who pointed them out to me. And they were these most tiny dots. And so when I heard this gronk or grok or grok or whatever it was over my head, just before the rain hit actually on Skye, I'd learnt enough, and without having heard them live, I wasn't certain, but it kind of made me go, that's something different. So I looked up, and there they are. And you all, if anybody's had experience birding, you all know that the feeling of that first sight of something, when you see it and you go, that's something new or something different or something slightly unusual, something beyond my experience. And luckily they gave me a decent view. They were flying quite slowly and quite close over my head, and they took their time about it. So it was a great moment, partly because I hadn't really properly seen any before, partly because I'd identified them off my own bat without somebody telling me what they were, and partly because I wasn't being rained on for another 30 seconds at least. So it's one of those things that will stick in my mind.
It comes across beautifully in the book. Now, the final question before I wrap up is also from Elizabeth, and this is a slightly philosophical one. Might Nick or Lev explain how the words for bird songs come to be? Do people really hear chaff or cheep? So a question on onomatopoeia, I suppose.
Oh, yeah. Well, the chiff-chaff's a good example, isn't it, Nick? Because in English, the chiff-chaff, which sings its song, a two-note thing, chiff-chaff, chiff-chaff, chiff, we call it chiff-chaff. In German, they call it zip-zap.
Zip-zap, yes.
Yeah, and in Dutch, I think it's something similar. So we all hear it differently, and we transliterate them differently. And a cuckoo, hoo-hoo, it should really be called a hoo-hoo, not a cuckoo, because there's no hard k in there. And but for those of that kind of who are of a like mind, might enjoy going through the Collins bird guide, looking at their transliterations of the birds, because they are incredibly specific. So if it'll describe a songbird, and it'll go, it sounds like this. Somebody's obviously been through a recording working out whether that is a tsu or tsi. But of course, more often than not, they don't really bear any relation. They're no help in identifying the sound, I don't think. I don't know if that's your experience, Nick.
Yes, very often they are very creative, shall we say, and yet some of the loosest descriptions, just to wrap up this little bit, to go back to an event we did live last year at Cley, back in the days when one could, with our wonderful friend Simon Barnes, who had just brought out On the Marsh, which is a perfect
lovely book.
In which he describes the song of the Chetty's warbler, and it says, me, I am Chetty. If you don't like it, F off. And that's a perfectly perfect description of the song of a Chetty's warbler. Now, before we say goodbye to Lev, I would like to thank everybody. Thank you all very, very much indeed for having attended. Should you wish to purchase Lev's book, and I cannot recommend it enough, it is a perfect...
You definitely do.
Lovely read. You do. You heard it from the man himself. You definitely do. Then please follow the link, which should be in your chat. It will certainly be in the emails you've received about this event. And by so doing, by purchasing Lev's book from Wild Sounds and Books, our friends in North Norfolk, you will make a 10% donation to Norfolk Wildlife Trust, for which thank you. And likewise, should you have enjoyed this evening and wish to make a donation, then thank you. Also, you can do that through the link. As I said earlier, if you are interested in others of these events, and we have the lovely Brigitte Strawbridge coming to talk to us very soon, followed by Matt Gore and some very exciting people following in January, February, March as well, then please go to cleycalling.com, which is where you can find out about all of our other events, which are part of the Cley Calling series of events. So it falls to me really just both to thank you, Lev, but also on behalf of Norfolk Wildlife Trust, very sincerely to extend an invitation to you to come to Hickling. We would love to show you swallowtail butterflies and cranes and booming bitterns or bitterns feeding their chicks or whatever it is. So please, please, please do come and join us.
I will definitely take you out. You've really painted yourself into a corner there, because I'm definitely going to take you up on that next summer.
Please do. It's one of our absolute flagships, and we'd love to see you there. The event will end very abruptly when Nick turns us off, so it remains for me simply to thank you very much indeed, Lev. Thank everybody for joining us. Thank you all very, very much indeed, and good night.
Good night. Bye.